Hello and welcome to CA 121, Chapter 4. I'm your course instructor, Heather Hines. Today we are going to be talking about database models and pivot tables. If you go to an interview and they ask you about your Excel knowledge and you throw out those keywords, I have worked with databases and I know how to create pivot tables, people will be very, very impressed. So first let's talk about databases. What is a database? That's basically just a lot of information in a table. Now you can have databases in Excel, and you can also have a database in what's called Microsoft Access. Microsoft Access is basically this really great tool. It's kind of like Excel Plus, where you can take a database and you can actually merge databases together. It allows you to do some really cool things with databases, and that it would be a completely different class. So today we're just going to kind of get a sneak peek at Microsoft Access and how it deals with data models. Now, what is a data model? That's when you incorporate data from multiple worksheets, and we are going to be importing them today from Microsoft Access. So here's an Excel spreadsheet. I have already downloaded the two Microsoft Access sheets, one about suppliers. So basically, let's take a kind of a sneak peek. This just gives me supplier ID, which is going to be the primary key. This supplier ID uniquely identifies each of my suppliers. So primary key uniquely identifies each of my rows. Okay, so I'm saying, okay, 1315 is Jared Chemicals and 1313 is Pullmax. So it's kind of like your social security number. It uniquely identifies each person or each supplier in this case. Okay, and so we have supplier information, and then we have another database that talks about, hey, these are the things that I've sold. So I have sold first aid kits to person 1314. Instead of writing out all their information, I just use their supplier ID. And so 1314, they have ordered several first aid kits in April, May, and June. 1312, in April they ordered lane markers. In June they ordered some more lane markers, and in May they ordered some more lane markers. And so on and so forth. You look at each supplier ID and you can see what they've ordered on this sheet. So in order to merge two databases together, they need to have what's called a relationship. In this case, you have to see, okay, what is the relationship? What's the relationship between these two tables? Well, in this case, it would be supplier ID. So they have the supplier ID in common. Okay, so a relationship is when two tables share a common field. What is a field? That's a column of related data. So in this case, what is the column of related data? That would be the supplier ID. Okay, so in this case, our relationship is supplier ID. The primary key is each unique ID number for each supplier. What is a field? A field is the column of related data. So this is a field 1312 that belongs to First Class Pool Supply. This is their address. They're in Anaheim, California, and this is their postal code. So that would be a record. And a field would be a column of related data. So supplier ID would be a field, supplier would be a field, address is another field, so on and so forth. All right, so let's talk about pivot tables. I think that the grader is a little bit lacking in that it doesn't really show you the full power of a pivot table. So pivot tables you can actually use with any table of data. You don't have to use it with a database model. So you'll recognize this is actually from your Chapter 2 grader, where we have all this information, and we were tasked with figuring out where are the total items in stock, average price, so on and so forth, how many tulip types were there, and what is the tulip quantity. Well, instead of using equations for each of one of these, remember we had to use sum and use count if and all that good stuff. We could have actually clicked anywhere on the table that we wanted, clicked insert pivot table, Usually we put it in a new worksheet, but let's just do it in the existing worksheet so we have everything side by side. It'll come up with something and it looks kind of weird at first. That's just because we haven't told it what we want it to do yet. So here are the field names. These come from the column titles. So quantity, stock, item number, item name, so on and so forth. And let's say, what if I wanted to figure out what are the total items in stock? So you see how my field pane kind of got moved away? That's because I'm no longer in my pivot table. So as soon as I click back in, now I have my pivot table fields. I want to know the total items in stock. So I might say, hey, let's put category in my rows and my quantity in stock for my values. The default is always sum, so I could have easily gone 2847 from there, right? And if I wanted average price, I could have said, okay, instead of quantity in stock, I could say, okay, let's look at price. The default is sum, so instead of sum, I would have said, okay, so I'm going to change that to average. $8.99, easy peasy lemon squeezy. And then I could say, okay, how many tulip types are there? So I can go back here and say, hey, let's go to, I have category, let's put category here, and I could have it count the category. So now I have, hey, how many tulip types are there? 5, easy peasy. Tulip total quantity, so instead of category, I could say, hey, how many tulips do I have in stock? 433. So that is the power of a pivot table. It allows you to easily organize and disseminate different data, and I can have several different things that I can do to the data pretty quickly. I could sum, count, average, max, min, product, so on and so forth. I can even show the values as a percentages, which is really awesome. So that is the power of a pivot table. So we just talked about pivot table. They summarize and analyze large amounts of data. You can have them come from a database. Remember, the default is a sum. When you are using a pivot table, you have what's called your filters area. Now, for some reason, it's not popping up like it normally does. Normally, it pops up right away. If for some reason it doesn't do that, you could go, you have pivot table tools, and you could go to your field list here, and it'll pop up your pivot table fields area, right? Here's the filters area, and we can basically just drag and click what we want it to summarize. And remember, if we want any numerical values here, we have to have something in the values category. So I could put anything I want in the category and item name, but if I wanted to do any type of calculation, I need to put it into the values section, okay? All right, our last two vocab for this chapter is a pivot chart and a slicer. Now, pivot chart is very specific. They come from pivot tables. So they're basically regular charts, but instead of coming from a table, it comes from a pivot table. So I would have to click anywhere on my pivot table, and then I can go to insert, and I can click on pivot chart, okay? So when I click on the pivot chart, they're basically like regular charts. I can click on anything I want and edit it that way. The next one is a slicer. Now, a slicer can come either from any type of table, either a pivot table or a regular table. So let's just say I wanted to insert a slicer. They're just graphic interface GUI, like kind of little buttons for people that don't know how to use Excel. So if you're making the spreadsheet for people that don't really know how to use Excel, you might insert a little slicer for them. And it'll automatically look at the column headings and say, hey, what slicer do you want? And I might say, hey, I want it for size. And I can make multiple slicers. Maybe I want it for size and retail price. So it'll give me a slicer for each one. So I might say, hey, for the size, I want them all to be 25, and it'll automatically filter the 25s. And hey, I also want the retail price to be only that, $7.85. So here we go. And I can clear the slicers. I can easily delete them. So slicers are just easy filtering buttons that you can apply to any data table, any table, and they're really for people that don't know how to use Excel, because I could have done the same thing by going here and filtering the same way. Okay. Hopefully this was helpful in helping you understand what is a pivot table, how to create them, and what is a data model from Microsoft Access. Stay tuned, I have another video on how to complete the chapter.